Sure. Well, the couple of things I think that are important to understand about environmentalism. First, of course, is that the government is by far the biggest polluter in the world. Government facilities are notoriously polluted. Army facilities are notoriously polluted. And if you count things like depleted uranium, which they've left scattered over vast portions of the Middle East, there's a huge amount of toxicity that governments have contributed or produced within the world. Government management of resources tends to be really bad. So, for instance, here in Canada, there was a 400-year cod fishery until the government began upping quotas to gain political points and votes, and then it just completely wiped it out within a few years. There is significant problems with the fantasy that government is going to be a great and effective steward of environmental resources. That list kind of goes on and on. So the best way to make the environment safer and cleaner, which I think we all want, is to recognize that moving things from the public sphere to the private sphere is the best way to achieve long-term efficiency and cleanliness. So any industrial process that produces waste is wasteful, and so ideally you want to find a way to recycle the waste. That's all going to occur in the private sector, as people sort of will bid up the waste. If the waste can't be recycled, at least under current technology, then you really want companies to be responsible for the effluents that they dump out into the air and the water and the ground. What happens in many places is the government gives permits, which is basically a license to pollute, and that is really quite disastrous for what goes on around them. So you want to sort of minimize that. The best way to do that is to have things privately owned, have beaches privately owned, have forests privately owned, have waterways and rivers privately owned. Then you have people who will put a bid in for these resources. So let's say I want to go buy part of a river. Well, I'm going to be able to bid the most for that resource if I get the longest and most valuable use out of it. In the same way, if I'm going to go bid up some forest land, let's say I'm a forester, I want to go bid up some forest land, I'm going to be able to bid the most if I get the greatest long-term value or use out of that forest land, which means I'm going to replant and regrow and so on. Or if I'm buying it because I want it to be a pristine wilderness for people to hike through and take photos, I'm going to get the greatest value if I can keep it clean and pristine. And so once people own something, they take a greater degree of care in maintaining its value. And that value can be economic, like you're using the trees, or it can be aesthetic, like you like looking at the trees and having nature. So once you privatize stuff, you give people an incentive. And in fact, ownership will tend to accrue to those people who can create the most sustainable value out of that resource, whether it's fisheries or a beach for kids to play on or whatever it is. Once people have that, then they will aggressively work to protect their investment. So if somebody pollutes and the pollution comes up on a beach, if it's a public beach, you've got a whole big political process to go through that may or may not work, and maybe the guy who runs the factory is a big friend of the politician or donates a lot of money to the political cause or whatever, and then things are really slow or never get done. But if it's private and it's through a court system, an intermediate system, it's much more likely to be effectively dealt with. So the basic idea is, I would imagine how it works is in a free society, you want clean air, clean water and so on. And so you would buy insurance for the quality of these things. So if I want clean air, I would buy insurance for clean air. And I would give a company, I don't know, 100 or 200 bucks a year saying that my air is going to be clean. If my air gets lower than a certain level of quality, you all got to pay for me to move or clean the air or find some way of solving it. And through that, you create a company which has a massive, like tens or hundreds of billions of dollar requirement or necessity to make sure that air is clean, and their profit and their paychecks and their bonuses all depend on keeping that air clean. That's a motive that we know works historically. Political motives are very sketchy and very hard to reproduce, even if they work temporarily. And so if someone creates some pollution plant, then starts messing up my air, well, first of all, they'll try and prevent that, right? So they'll make sure that they'll buy up the land around, or they'll, make sure that nobody puts something too polluting in. If somebody does, even against what they're trying to do to prevent it, then, they have up to the liability they're exposed to minus $1 worth of financial resources to go and combat this. Maybe they buy the guy out, or maybe they say, listen, we'll put scrubbers in, because putting scrubbers in costs us a couple of $1 million, whereas if the air gets polluted with everyone who's insured with us, it's going to cost us hundreds of millions, so we'll do that. And so you get this interweaving system of private ownership and profit incentives that is the best way to ensure that the air and the water and the ground stays clean, and that there's no substitute for that financial self-interest. There's no magical third-party wand of perfect altruism that is going to make bureaucrats care more than people do about their own property. So expecting the government to solve pollution in the long term is like waiting for people to put oil changes in their rental cars. It's simply not going to happen. Once you own something, you take care of it. That's the best way to ensure it.